She was 19 years old, a widow, with $20 and a piece of paper in her hand. The man who handed them to her called it generosity. She called it what it was: a death sentence with a lawyer's signature at the bottom. The deed was for an abandoned supply depot in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 12 miles up a logging road. No neighbors, no shelter worth the name, and winter was already gathering in the high peaks. He expected her to disappear. Most people would have. But what Aldous Graves never knew, what he could not have known, was that her father had been to that depot before her, and her father had left something behind. Not gold. Not at first. Something older than gold. Something that had been waiting in the cold dark behind a stone hearth for 14 years. Waiting for someone with the right hands to find it, the right eyes to read it, the right name on the envelope. Her name. This is the story of Cora Voss, a carpenter's daughter, a young widow with $20 and a deed to a ruin, and the wartime secret that changed everything. Settle in. She was 19 years old, and she was already learning that some men measure the worth of a person the same way they measure the worth of land, by what they can take from it. Aldous Graves was that kind of man. He had the hands of a banker and the eyes of a crow. Everything he looked at, he was already calculating, already dividing, already deciding what belonged to him and what could be discarded. Cora Voss had known this about him from the first day Tobias brought her home. She had smiled anyway, set the table, learned which chair he preferred, learned not to speak unless spoken to in that house, learned that the grand white mansion on the hill was not a home. It was a ledger, and she was an entry that had never quite balanced. For 2 years she managed it, because Tobias was there. Tobias with his quiet laugh. Tobias who would squeeze her hand under the dinner table when his father said something cold. Tobias who named every bird by its song and loved the mountains his father was busy destroying one tree at a time. Tobias was the reason she stayed. And then Tobias was gone. A falling tree, a logging camp. A Tuesday in late September that started like any other Tuesday and ended like the last day of everything she had ever loved. The funeral was a performance. Aldous Graves stood at the front of the church with the bearing of a man accepting condolences for a business loss. His face arranged into something that resembled grief. His eyes doing calculations. Cora stood beside him in a borrowed black dress and felt like a ghost that hadn't yet been told it was dead. The weeks after were worse than the funeral. The coldness that had always lived in that house turned into something else, something with edges. She would walk into a room and Aldous would look up from his desk and look through her, as if she were already gone, as if the paperwork just hadn't been filed yet. She knew what was coming. she had known since the third day after the burial. When Aldous' lawyer arrived at the house carrying a leather satchel and did not ask to speak with her, so she was not surprised when the summons came.
A knock at her door, early morning, 4th week after Tobias was buried. A housemaid with eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers. "Mr. Graves will see you in the study, not a request." Cora dressed carefully, slowly, the way her father had taught her to approach a difficult joint in a piece of wood, with attention, with calm. Don't rush the thing that matters.
She took the carved whippoorwill from the mantelpiece, the small bird Tobias had made for her on their first anniversary. Mountain laurel wood worn smooth from the number of times she'd held it. She pressed it into her palm and walked down the stairs. The study smelled of leather and ledgers and something older. Something that had been locked inside that room for so long it had become part of the walls. Aldous stood behind his desk, a fortress of polished walnut between them. He did not ask her to sit. She noticed that.
She noticed everything in that room. The way the morning light came through the curtains at an angle that left his face half in shadow. The stack of papers already arranged on the desk. Arranged before she arrived. This conversation had been prepared. She was the last piece of it. Josephine. He began, then corrected himself. Cora, the estate has been settled. He gestured to the papers as if they had already made the argument for him, which she supposed they had.
"Thomas," he said. "Tobias. He made no specific provision for you beyond standard dower rights, given the short duration of the marriage and the absence of children. He said the last part the way a man mentions a deficiency in a contract, a missing clause, a thing that should have been there and wasn't. The house, the contents, the land. It all reverts to the estate." He slid a thin envelope across the desk. "This is $20. It is more than generous under the circumstances." He paused. "I have also had the deed to the old Confederate supply depot at Miller's Gap transferred to your name. It is a worthless property, but it is a holding. No one can say I left you with nothing." The cruelty of it was almost architectural. She recognized it the way her father had taught her to recognize a poorly constructed facade. The surface looked solid. The framing behind it was rotten to the core. $20 and a deed to a ruin 12 miles up a mountain road. In October, with winter already sharpening its teeth in the high peaks. It was a death sentence dressed in paperwork. She looked at Aldous Graves, really looked at him, the flat gray of his eyes, the slight satisfaction he was working so hard to hide. This was a man who had built an empire in this valley, who had shaken hands at her wedding and placed flowers on his own son's grave, and was now sliding $20 across his desk like tipping a servant he was letting go. She thought of Tobias. She thought of what Tobias had once said to her very quietly on a walk along a creek bed the summer before he died. His voice low, almost to himself. There are things about my father, Cora, things I've been trying to understand. Don't let him make you small. Promise me. She had not known what he meant then. She was beginning to understand now.
Cora took the envelope, took the deed, looked at the name of the place on the paper. Miller's Gap. She had heard it before. Tobias had pointed to that ridge once on one of their walks. Said his father owned the old depot up there. Said it had been used as a Confederate supply station during the war. Said it had been abandoned since. Said it had good water and a defensible position and a view clear down the valley. He had said it as a historical observation. He had not known it would be the only thing she had left.
"I will be gone by morning," she said. Her voice sounded like someone else's voice. Calm, final, like a door being closed on something that had been open too long. She turned and walked out of the study. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel his cold satisfaction at her back like a draft from a window left open in January. He went upstairs to the room she had shared with Tobias. She packed her single carpet bag,
One spare dress, a bar of soap, a tin of matches, her father's whetstone smooth from years of use, a worn wool blanket. She folded Tobias's favorite flannel shirt and placed it on top. She looked around the room once. The furniture that had never been hers, the curtains she had not chosen, the window that looked out over the grounds that would belong to Aldous Graves until the day he died. She picked up the whippoorwill from the mantelpiece one last time, pressed it into her palm, closed her fingers around it. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the moon cross the sky and listened to the house settle around her, thinking about her father, about the way Edmund Voss had built things carefully, with attention to what was true. He had built houses that stood for 30 years after other men's houses had fallen. He had built barns that held their shape through storms that stripped the county bare. He had also built something else, she realized. Something she hadn't understood until now. He had built her. Before dawn, while the house was dark and silent, she slipped out the back door, closed it softly, walked down the gravel drive. The cold hit her immediately. October cold, not winter yet, but winter's advance scout, the kind of cold that is politely informing you of what is coming. She did not look back at the house. She never looked back at it again. The road east of town was empty at that hour, gray light beginning behind the far ridge. The kind of morning that doesn't so much arrive as accumulate. She walked with her carpet bag in one hand and the deed folded in her coat pocket and Tobias's carved bird pressed against her palm inside her other fist. One foot, then the other. She passed through town before anyone was properly awake. A dog barked from behind a fence, a light in the bakery window. The smell of wood smoke from the blacksmith's chimney where the forge was already going. No one stopped her.
No one called her name. She had lived 2 years in this county as Tobias Graves's wife, and she walked through its center at dawn with a carpet bag, and not one person opened a door. That told her everything she needed to know about whose valley this was.
She walked east for the better part of the day. The farms thinned out. The road narrowed from graded dirt to rutted track. The tidy pastures gave way to dense rhododendron thickets and stands of white pine that pressed close on both sides. The air changed, thinner, colder. It smelled of wet stone and fallen leaves and something her father used to call mountain air. The kind that made you feel like your lungs had been doing the work wrong all along. This was the land Tobias had loved. The land his father was busy turning into money. She thought about that as she walked, about the difference between those two men. Same blood, same name, and yet Tobias had looked at these mountains and seen something worth preserving. Aldous had looked at them and seen board feet of lumber. You could love the same land and have completely different conversations with it. You could build something here, or you could take it apart. Those were the only two choices her father used to say. You're always doing one or the other. Edmund Voss had been a builder. She intended to be one too. By late afternoon, the track had begun climbing in earnest. Her legs ached. The carpet bag, which had seemed manageable at dawn, had developed opinions about the situation. Her back had joined in. The cold deepened as she climbed, and the last of the afternoon light fell at a low angle through the bare oaks and hickories, casting long shadows across the track.
She passed a creek crossing, stopped, drank from the cold water, ate the last biscuit she'd taken from the Graves' kitchen that morning, thought about what she was walking toward. A Confederate supply depot, abandoned since the war ended. 14 years of weather and wildlife, 12 miles from town, $20 in her pocket, and winter coming. Anyone reasonable would have turned around. Which was, she supposed, exactly what Aldous Graves was counting on.
She stood up, picked up the bag, kept walking. Dusk arrived quickly in the mountains. One moment the sky was gray gold. The next, it was bruised purple. The temperature dropped a full 10 degrees in what felt like 10 minutes. The wind picked up from the north carrying something in it. The first suggestion of snow. Not snow itself, just the announcement. She was beginning to doubt she'd found the right trail when she saw it. Through a screen of hemlock and bare poplar, a dark shape against the darkening sky. Low and solid. A silhouette of squared logs and stone. Half swallowed by the forest that had been quietly and patiently reclaiming it for a decade and a half. The depot at Miller's Gap. She stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it. It was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Built from massive hand-hewn poplar logs, weathered now to a silver gray
that caught the last light and held it. The corners were joined with dovetail notches. Her father would have noticed those first. She noticed them now. That was good work. That was someone who knew what they were doing. The porch along the front had a problem. One of the support posts had rotted through at the base, and the roof lines sagged badly on the left side. The door hung at an angle from a single surviving iron hinge, its companion long since rusted and gone. Most of the window openings were empty, gaping holes in the log walls where glass had once been and wasn't anymore. One window still had a few shards in the frame. The rest were open to the weather. The north-facing side of the shake roof was carpeted in moss. Ivy was doing its slow work on the stone foundation. But the ridgepole was straight and true. She could see that from 50 feet away. The chimney at the western end was massive, built from local granite laid with real skill. That chimney was not going anywhere. She walked slowly around the entire structure before she touched it. Her father had taught her that. Always walk around first. Don't assume you understand a building from one angle. Let it show you all its faces. Let it tell you what it needs. What this building needed was considerable. What it had was bones. Good ones. She pushed the heavy door inward. It scraped across the packed earth floor with a sound like a complaint, like it hadn't had to do this in years and wasn't sure it appreciated being asked again. Inside, the smell hit her first. Damp stone, dry rot, the faint ghost of animals that had sheltered here in past winters. Leaves, dust, and underneath all of it something she couldn't quite name. Age, maybe. Purpose, waiting. The moon was rising and gave her enough light to see the general shape of the space. One large room, vastly empty. Warped shelves along the long walls. A few rusted barrel hoops in a corner. The dirt floor littered with leaves, and the evidence of small animals who had been making free with the place for years. And at the far end, the fireplace. She crossed to it without thinking, as if pulled. It was enormous, built to heat a space that would have held dozens of men and tons of supplies. The firebox was deep and wide. The lintel stone above it was a single piece of granite longer than she was tall. The chimney above it rose straight and massive through the roof. She ran her hand along the edge of the firebox. Cold stone, rough under her fingers, real. This was not the polished marble of the Graves house. This was not something built to impress. This was something built to work. And it had been built by someone who understood the difference. She set down her carpet bag. The sound of it hitting the dirt floor was very small in that large empty room. But it was hers, all of it. The drafts through the empty windows, the sagging porch, the leaves on the floor
and the mice in the walls and the moss on the roof. Hers.
The first thing in her life that was entirely and only hers. She was too tired to light a fire that night. She swept a space clean with a pine branch, laid out her blanket, put the carpet bag under her head, and pressed the whippoorwill into her palm. The wind found every gap in the walls and made commentary. She slept anyway, deep and dreamless, the way you sleep when you've stopped running and finally stood still. She rose with the gray light.
Her breath came out in plumes. The cold in the room was the aggressive kind that had been sitting there all night and felt entitled to the space. She stood up, rolled her blanket, and went to work. First water. Tobias had mentioned a spring nearby. She found it within 20 minutes, a steady trickle of clear water pushing out of a crack in a granite outcropping 20 yards north of the building. Cold enough to make her teeth ache. Clean. She cupped her hands and drank and felt the cold run all the way down. Good water.
She thought of what Tobias had said about this place. Good water, defensible position, view clear down the valley. He had said it as if reciting a historical curiosity. He had pointed to this ridge on one of their walks and told her about it with the easy fondness he had for anything old and forgotten and belonging to the mountains. He had not known it would be the only thing she had. She thought about that a lot in those early days. How much of her life had been shaped by things Tobias had said without knowing why he was saying them. She got the door rehung properly within the first day, using a piece of hardwood she split from a fallen branch and her father's whetstone to sharpen the edges of the old hinge pins. The door still scraped, but it sat true now. It closed all the way. That mattered. She stripped Tobias's flannel shirt into strips and used them to re-chink the gaps where the old daubing had crumbled from between the logs. She sacrificed her spare dress to tack over the 2 largest window openings. It would not keep the cold out entirely, but it would take the edge off. The fire was her third priority. She gathered wood for most of the second day, dead falls mostly. Birch that was dry enough to catch. A section of hardwood trunk she spent an hour splitting with a flat stone and the heel of her boot, which was not the most efficient method, but was the method available to her. When she finally knelt at the hearth and struck a match, she waited. The tinder caught. The kindling above it caught. The first tentative tongue of flame licked upward into the firebox and then steadied. She fed it carefully, a twig at a time, then small branches, then the split hardwood, and then the chimney drew. She heard it before she saw it, a deep, low breath like the building inhaling. The smoke that had been curling uncertainly into the room suddenly found purpose. Shot upward. The fire responded, grew certain. The stone walls of the firebox began to absorb the heat and hold it. She sat back on her heels and watched.
The flames pushed light and warmth into the cold room, and the shadows retreated to the corners, and the depot felt for one moment like something that had been waiting to be found,
like something that was glad she'd come. That night, she inspected the hearth properly for the first time. She was thinking about repointing the mortar, planning what she would need, running her hands along the stone as she went.
The main body of the fireplace was one piece of work, solid, old. The joints tight with age. She could feel the skill in it, the way each stone had been chosen for its shape and fitted to its neighbor.
But on the left side of the firebox, extending about 6 feet along the wall, something was different. She pressed her fingers to the surface. The stones were the same granite, pulled from the same hills, but the mortar joints were slightly thinner, the color a half shade lighter, as if this section had been done at a different time, by a different hand. Her father had taught her to notice exactly this kind of thing. 2 men's work side by side, Josie, he had said once, watching her run her hand along a joint in a wall they were building together.
You can always tell. Not because one is better than the other, because no 2 people have the same conversation with stone. She tapped each stone with the butt of the whetstone. Thud, thud, solid, thud, solid, thud. And then one stone, large, squarish, set low near the floor. A sound that was nothing like the others.
A hollow, resonant boom that she felt as much as heard. She tapped it again. Same sound. There was a space behind it. For a moment, she just knelt there on the dirt floor with the whetstone in her hand and the fire at her back and the mountains pressing cold against the walls, and she didn't move. Didn't breathe, just listened to the thing her own hands had found. Then she set down the whetstone, found the rusted iron pry bar in the corner where she'd noticed it on her second day, and began.
The mortar was old, hard, not the crumbling kind that came away easily. The kind that had been mixed well and set well and had 30-odd years to become part of the wall. The pry bar was the wrong tool for the job. Her knuckles paid for that, scraped raw against the granite. Her shoulders told her about it by the end of the first hour. She did not stop.
The sun moved across the sky. The fire burned down, and she fed it without looking away from the wall for long. Chip, chip. The mortar came away in fragments, small ones, then larger ones as she found the lines. The stone shifted, just slightly, a fraction of an inch. But she felt it. She repositioned the bar, put her full weight on it. The stone resisted, groaned, then scraped outward. Cold air breathed out from the opening that appeared behind it, stale, dry, and something else. The smell of old paper,
of a space that had been sealed and dark for a very long time. She worked faster now. 2 more stones above the first, her hands shaking. Not from cold, from something else entirely. She made an opening just wide enough to fit through. She needed light. She took a splinter of resinous heart pine from the kindling, lit it in the hearth, held it before her, and she went in.
The hidden room was small, 6 feet by 8, maybe 8 by 8. The same stone walls as the rest of the structure, but close, tight. The clever mass of the chimney had kept the moisture out, kept the cold out even. The air was dry and very still. Her torch sent shadows jumping across the walls. The room was not empty. In the center of the floor sat a heavy, iron-strapped chest. Military issue. The kind a paymaster would use to move funds. On top of it rested a stiff leather satchel and a cylindrical tin case, the kind used to protect rolled maps or documents. Both covered in 14 years of undisturbed dust. Cora stood in the doorway with the pine torch in her hand and looked at what she had found. Her mind kept offering her reasonable explanations. A cache of preserves, old tools, someone's forgotten store of something ordinary. Her mind kept failing. This was not ordinary. She crossed the small space, knelt before the chest. The padlock on it was rusted solid. She set that aside for later, turned to the leather satchel instead. The buckles were tarnished but intact. She undid them with fingers that were not entirely steady. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had kept the moisture out for over a decade, were a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and several small leather-bound ledgers. She took the top ledger carefully. The oilskin crackled as she unwrapped it. The leather of the cover was dry but solid. She opened it. The handwriting inside was precise. Trained, military. The entries were dated and numbered, each one a record of payment, an amount, a date, a description. And at the top of the first page, a heading. She read it twice. Bureau of Military Accounts, Union Forces, Union Documents, in a Confederate supply depot. Her hand was very still. Her breath had gone quiet. She turned pages, more entries, more payments, all the same careful handwriting, all the same format, and then a name, a Graves, and then again, a Graves, payment for information, troop movement, a Graves, maps of local fortifications, a Graves, militia leadership roster. She turned more pages. Aldous Graves, the man who had cast her out with $20. The man who stood at the front of every county meeting and every church service and every community gathering as the emblem of Confederate loyalty and righteous Southern principle, had sold information to the Union over and over for years, for money.
The payments had begun in 1862. They ran through the end of the war. The amounts were not small. The information was specific. Battle positions, supply routes, names of men who had died in those battles. Men from this valley. She sat very still on the floor of the hidden room with the ledger open across her knees and felt the world rearrange itself around her. Everything Aldous Graves had built in this county, the timber empire, the bank, the land holdings that had put half the valley in his debt, all of it. Every board and every dollar and every deed. Built on betrayal, built on the blood of his own neighbors. And then she reached the bottom of the satchel and found the letter. A sealed envelope. The wax seal still intact, though cracked with age. The address on the front written in the same military hand as the ledger. To whoever finds this, she broke the seal. The letter was dated April 1865, written by a man who named himself Captain Leland Pruitt, Intelligence Officer, Union Forces. He wrote in clear, controlled sentences that grew slightly less steady toward the bottom of the page. He had been operating in this region for 3 years. His primary local contact had been a merchant and landowner named Aldous Graves, who had provided intelligence of considerable value to the Union cause, and who had in April of 1865 led Captain Pruitt and his detail into a Confederate ambush. Pruitt had survived, barely. He had made it to the depot with his wounds and what remained of the operational funds and the full intelligence file. He had found the local carpenter, Edmund Voss, a man he had worked with before, a man he trusted. And Edmund Voss had built him this room. Pruitt had been taken prisoner before Edmund finished the work. He had not died in the ambush as he feared he might. He had survived the war, been released, made his way north. But returning to Virginia while Aldous Graves was still powerful and free was not a thing he could safely do. So the room had stayed sealed. The money had stayed where it was. And Pruitt had written his letter to whoever might find it. He wrote, Aldous Graves is a man of no loyalty save to money. He played both sides for his own enrichment. The gold in the chest is federal property. The ledgers are proof of his treachery. Use them to see justice done. Then one more line, written in a hand that had grown unsteady by then. Edmund Voss is a man of more honor than he knows. I hope his daughter is like him. Cora's eyes stopped. Read that again. I hope his daughter is like him. Pruitt had known her father well enough to know Edmund Voss had a daughter. Her father had built this room knowing that. She sat on the cold floor of the hidden room for a long time. The pine torch burned lower. The shadows thickened. Outside, the fire in the great hearth had burned down to coals. Aldous Graves had given her $20 and a deed to this place. He had thought he was giving her a death sentence. What he had actually given her was her father's last gift. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of wakefulness than the nights in the Graves house. Those nights had been hollow, empty in the way that grief empties a person out. Leaves them just a shell sitting in a chair waiting for morning. This night was full, too full. She sat by the fire with the ledger open across her knees and the letter in her hand, and her mind going in every direction at once. The flames had rebuilt themselves from the coals, and the great stone hearth threw warmth across the room, and outside the wind moved through the hemlocks with a sound like breathing. She read Captain Pruitt's letter 3 more times. Each time she got to that last line, she stopped. I hope his daughter is like him. Her father had known this man, had worked with him, had built him a room in the dark and the cold of a Virginia winter while a war was ending around them, and had never said one word about it. Not to her, not to anyone she knew of. Edmund Voss had carried this secret for 11 years. He had carried it, and then he had died with it. Fever took him in the spring of 1876, and he had been there in the morning and gone by afternoon.
In the way fever sometimes moved through a person like a fire through dry grass and vinyl, and leaving nothing. She had been 16. She remembered every hour of that day. She did not remember him saying anything about a depot in the mountains, or a Union captain, or a chest full of federal gold behind a fireplace. Which meant one of 2 things.
Either he had planned to tell her and hadn't gotten there in time, or he had trusted that she would find it herself. She looked around the hidden room. At the walls her father had laid stone by stone in the winter of 1864. At the careful work of it, tight joints, level courses, the same hands that had built the tool shed behind their house on Cane Creek Road. The same hands that had taught hers. He had built this room knowing she might one day need it, or someone like her. Someone who came to this place with nothing and needed what was hidden here to survive. She closed the ledger, set it carefully back in the oilskin, and sat with the weight of what she had found pressing down on her chest like a stone of its own. The gold in that locked chest was more money than she had ever seen in her life, more money than her father had earned in 20 years of honest work. It was federal property. Pruitt's letter was clear about that. But Pruitt was somewhere in Pennsylvania, had been for 14 years, and Aldous Graves was in a white mansion at the bottom of this mountain with half the valley in his pocket. She could take the gold and disappear. The thought came to her clearly and without shame. She considered it the way her father had taught her to consider every option in a construction problem. Lay them all out. Look at each one honestly. Don't pretend the bad ideas aren't there. She could take the money and go west. Start over somewhere no one knew the name Graves. Somewhere the shadow of that valley didn't reach. She sat with that option. Then she thought of the ledger.
The names, the dates,
the specific notations of what information had been sold and when, and what had happened afterward. The ambushes, the routes compromised, the men who had walked into Confederate fire because Aldous Graves had sold their positions to the Union for money, while telling every widow in the county that her husband had died for a noble cause. And then she thought of Tobias,
of that walk along the creek bed, his voice low and careful, the way he had looked at the mountains when he said it. There are things about my father I've been trying to understand. He had known something, not everything, but something. She pressed the carved whippoorwill against her sternum and stared at the ceiling of the hidden room and made a decision. Not the easy one, the right one. But she could not do it alone.
She needed two things. She needed to secure her position here, and she needed someone who had more reason than she did to want Aldous Graves brought low. Someone who had been waiting longer for it. She thought she knew where to find that person. In the days that followed, she worked. Because work was the thing she knew how to do when the world had gone sideways. Because her hands knew what to do, even when her mind was still sorting itself out. Because her father had taught her that the way through a hard thing was always through it. Never around, never underneath, straight through. She used some of the gold, not much. 10 coins sewn carefully into the hem of her dress in the pre-dawn dark of the 4th morning. She had held each one in her palm before she placed it. The weight of a double eagle, solid, warm from the fire. The kind of weight that meant something. She walked 2 days north, not to the town at the bottom of the mountain, not where Aldous Graves held every debt and every ear and every whispered conversation in his fist. North, to a different county, a different town, a place where she was a stranger and strangers were nobody's particular business. She bought a felling axe, a bucksaw, a hammer, a keg of nails, 2 sacks of flour, a side of bacon, salt, coffee, a wool blanket heavy enough to matter, 2 panes of glass wrapped carefully in an old quilt. She paid with 1 coin. The merchant looked at the coin, looked at her, looked at the coin again. She met his gaze and said nothing. He made change without further comment. She hired a man with the cart to haul her supplies to the base of the trail, and from there she carried everything herself. Load by load, up the mountain, her shoulders burning, her lungs burning. The cold so sharp it felt personal by the time she reached the depot each time. 4 trips. She made 4 trips up that mountain in 2 days and did not complain to anyone because there was no one to complain to. By the end of the 2nd day, the depot had glass in its 2 main windows. The door hung true. The porch roof had been temporarily braced with green hardwood posts that she'd shape properly when the season allowed. The shelves along the main wall had been tested and 2 of them reinforced. She stood in the center of the room and looked at what she had made of the place. Not finished, not by a long way, but real, warm, solid, hers. And then she went to find Gideon Rowe. Tobias had mentioned him once, just once, on a Sunday afternoon when they had been sitting on the porch of the Graves house, and Tobias had been in one of his quiet moods. The kind where things he had been thinking about for a long time came out sideways. He had said there was an old man up in a high cove north of Miller's Gap who had been the best timberman in the county before Aldous Graves took his land in a legal dispute so thoroughly arranged that even the judge had looked embarrassed. Said the man's name was Gideon Rowe. Said his father had done it because Gideon had testified at a county meeting that the Graves mill was dumping waste into the creek that fed 3 farms downstream. Said it quietly, with the particular shame of a man who loves someone whose actions he cannot defend. She found the cove after a full day of walking, tucked into the high ground north of the depot, a small cabin so perfectly situated in its hollow that you could walk past the entrance to the cove twice without seeing it, which she did. The kind of building that had been placed with care by someone who understood the relationship between a structure and its land. Smoke from the chimney. She knocked. The door opened, and a long rifle came with it. Gideon Rowe was tall and angular in the way of men who have been lean their whole lives, somewhere past 65. A beard the color of river frost, eyes that were pale and absolutely direct, and had clearly spent decades deciding what was worth looking at and what was not. He looked at her. She had the sense of being measured for something she hadn't applied for. "My name is Cora Voss," she said. "Tobias Graves was my husband." Something moved across his face. Fast. There and gone. "I heard what happened to him," he said. His voice was low, mountain slow, the kind of voice that had never learned to hurry. "I've taken the old depot at Miller's Gap," she said. "The roof needs work I can't do alone. I'll pay in coin." She held up one of the double eagles between 2 fingers. He stared at the coin for a long moment. Then he looked back at her face. Not at the coin. At her face. She did not look away. She had decided before she knocked on that door that she would not look away from anything in this conversation. Because men like Gideon Rowe did not respond to softness. They responded to honesty. And the particular kind of steadiness that announces a person has already decided what they are and what they are not. "Aldous Graves," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "He put your husband in the ground," he said. She said nothing. "He took your home," he said. She said nothing. "He gave you that depot to die in," he said. Still nothing. He looked at her a long time more. Then he lowered the rifle. "You'd better come in," he said. The inside of his cabin was the neatest space she had been in since she left her father's house. Everything in its place. Everything with a reason. A single chair by the fire, a bunk along one wall, tools hanging on pegs in an order that made sense if you thought about the sequence of work they served. A shelf of books, more than she would have expected, their spines worn from reading. He made coffee. She sat in the single chair because he gestured her toward it, and he stood by the fire. She told him what she needed: the roof, the window frames, work she could not do alone. She spoke plainly, no performance, no appeal to his sympathy, just the work and the coin. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I won't take your coin." She started to speak. He held up one hand. "I'll come," he said. "Not for money, because Aldous Graves has been a poison in this valley for 20 years, and any enemy of his is worth my mourning." He paused. "And because Tobias Graves was the only decent thing to come out of that family, and somebody ought to do something in his name." He looked at the fire. "I'll come tomorrow," he said. "First light." She nodded. She stood up. At the door she stopped and turned back. He was already looking at her. "There is something else," she said. "I found something in the depot, in a hidden room behind the fireplace. I need to tell you about it, but not tonight." His pale eyes did not widen, did not narrow. They simply waited. "When you're ready," he said. She walked back to the depot in the dark. 3 days later, Gideon arrived, as promised at first light, with a mule carrying split cedar shakes and a froe and mallet for making more. He worked without commentary, which suited her. She worked beside him, and they found a rhythm quickly, the way two people who are both good at something will find a shared tempo without needing to discuss it. He showed her the right angle for laying the shakes for maximum drainage. She showed him her father's method for bracing a sagging beam from below without removing the roof load. He looked at it, tried it, nodded once. That was the conversation. On the third evening, when the fire was going and the coffee was hot and the new shakes had closed most of the worst gaps in the roof, she told him. She brought out the ledger, unwrapped it, set it on the table between them. He read for a long time. She watched his face. His expression did not change much, but his hands did. She noticed his hands on the edge of the table tighten, just slightly, and then deliberately relax. The way a man controls himself when what he wants to do is something he has decided he won't do. He turned pages. He found the entry she had been waiting for him to find. He stopped. His jaw moved once. "His brother," she said quietly. The entry from October 1864. His brother had been in the 14th Virginia Militia, had died in an ambush in November of 1864. The family had been told it was a Union scouting party acting on bad luck and good intelligence. It had not been bad luck. Gideon closed the ledger, set his hands flat on the table, and looked at the wall for a while. Cora said nothing. Let the silence do what it needed to do. After a long time, he said, "What are you going to do with it?" She said, "I don't know yet. I need someone who knows the law, someone who can tell me what this is worth and how to use it without getting myself killed in the process. He turned to look at her then. "There is a man," he said slowly. "A doctor. Name of Harwick Finch. Lost his practice 10 years ago when Aldous Graves started a rumor that he'd mishandled a birth and cost a woman her child. It was a lie. Everyone in the county knew it was a lie. Didn't matter. He said it, and people believed it, because people believe what the most powerful man in the room says, even when they know better." He paused. "Finch knows the law well enough, and he has a reason." She nodded. "Can you get him here?" she said.
He looked at her steadily.
"I can," he said. He came a week later. Dr. Harwick Finch was 71 years old and walked with a cane and had the eyes of a much younger man. Sharp and gray and slightly amused at the world in the particular way of someone who has been wronged by it and has decided that bitterness is a waste of a good mind.
He arrived with Gideon on a Tuesday morning and accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the table and listened to Cora explain what she had found with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing what it was. When she finished, she laid the ledger in front of him. He read it. He read it carefully, thoroughly, turning every page, reading every entry. And then she handed him the letter, Captain Pruitt's letter.
And she watched Harwick Finch's hands begin to shake. Not from age. She had seen old hands shake from age. This was not that. "Leland Pruitt," he said. The name came out of him like something that had been lodged there for years. Leland Pruitt was my cousin. She had not known that. Gideon had not told her that part. "We were told he deserted," Finch said. "Took the federal payroll and ran. That was the story. The official story." And Aldous Graves stood in my uncle's parlor and shook his hand and said what a shame. Said some men just didn't have the character. He looked up from the letter. His eyes were wet. He had looked my uncle in the face and said that. "For 15 years, he said. My family has carried that." The room was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. Cora let the silence sit for a moment, and then she said, "I need to know how to use this. Carefully, so that it can't be buried again." Finch set the letter down, folded his hands on top of it, and looked at her with those sharp gray eyes. "You are Edmund Voss's daughter," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, as if something had confirmed itself. Then he said, "Your father came to me once, years ago, before he was sick. He said he knew something about Aldous Graves that could bring the man down. He said he wasn't ready to act on it yet, that he needed more time to think about the right way to do it." He looked at her steadily. He never came back. I always thought he had changed his mind. "He hadn't changed his mind," Cora said. "No," said Finch. "I see that now." They sat together for a long time that afternoon. Finch
and Gideon and Cora around the table in the depot that Edmund Voss had once come to in a winter, not unlike this one, and done his most important work in secret and silence. Finch knew the law. He knew what the ledgers were worth in a court. He knew what Pruitt's letter established and what it couldn't prove alone. He knew that the testimony of a living witness would be worth more than documents in a Virginia county where Aldous Graves had spent 20 years shaping the opinions of every magistrate and justice within 40 miles. "There is one more thing," Finch said. He set down his coffee. "Leland Pruitt is still alive." She looked at him. "He retired to a town in Pennsylvania after the war. I had a letter from him 12 years ago. He could not come back to Virginia while Graves was standing, but I've kept track of him." He looked at her. His testimony combined with these documents would be irrefutable. It would be enough. Cora looked at the ledger on the table, then at Finch, then at Gideon. "I need you to go to him," she said to Finch. "I need you to bring him back." Finch nodded slowly. "I'll go," he said, "but it will take time. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. She nodded. "We'll be here," she said. The day after Finch left, the lawyer came. She did not know him. He was not from the local town. Aldous had reached into a different county for this one. A careful, colorless man in a good coat who arrived on horseback on a Wednesday morning and knocked at the depot door with the kind of politeness that is really just threat wearing nicer clothes. He was pleasant, very pleasant. He explained that his client, Mr. Aldous Graves, had become aware that Mrs. Voss was attempting to make a home of this property and wished her only well in that endeavor. However, given the remote location and the difficulty of the coming winter, and the general unsuitability of the structure for year-round habitation, Mr. Graves had authorized his representative to offer $200 for the deed, a more than fair price for a property of this description. He smiled. Mrs. Voss. She let him finish. She had prepared for something like this, had thought about it from several angles, had decided before he arrived what her face would do, and what her voice would do, and what her hands would do. Her face said nothing. Her hands stayed in her lap. "No, thank you," she said. The smile held, but something behind it changed. Mrs. Voss Winter in the Blue Ridge at this elevation is not a trifling matter. The offer is genuinely generous. Perhaps you should take some time to consider. "I have considered," she said. "The answer is no." He looked at the room, at the repaired windows, the solid door, the stacked firewood. He was a man who read spaces the way his clients read ledgers, and he was reading this one now. She watched him do it. He looked back at her. His pleasant expression had not moved. "I'll convey your response to Mr. Graves," he said. "You do that," she said. She showed him out. She stood at the window and watched him ride back down the mountain trail until the trees swallowed him. Then she went to find Gideon. He was splitting shakes on the south side of the building.
He stopped when he saw her face. $200, she said. He set the fro down. He's afraid of something, Gideon said. He doesn't offer money for things he thinks are his. I know, she said.
She told him what she had been thinking since the night she first read the ledger. The thing that had been settling into shape in the back of her mind over the past 2 weeks. Aldous Graves had never come to this property in 14 years. Not once. A man who owned everything in a 30-mile radius had never visited a building on land he held the original deed to. Had left it to rot. And then, when his own daughter-in-law had been handed the deed and walked up that mountain, he had waited not 3 weeks before sending a lawyer with money. He knew, she said. Gideon looked at her. He knew Edmund Voss had done something here, she said. He didn't know what exactly, but he knew enough to be afraid of this place. Giving me the deed was a gamble. He thought I'd die up here or give up and leave. He never thought I'd stay. She paused. He never thought I'd find it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, which means he'll try again, and the next time won't be a lawyer with money. She knew that too. She had known it since she watched the lawyer ride away, which was when she told Gideon about Dorothea Price. Dorothea was a widow who lived in the valley about 4 miles below the depot trail. She had lost her husband the same September Cora had lost Tobias. Same logging camp, same week. Her husband had been the foreman. The accident had been blamed on his negligence, on his failure to clear the Widowmaker branch that had hung suspended above the work area. The same Widowmaker branch that had killed 2 men in 1 week. Gideon knew her. She lost everything after he said. The company wouldn't pay. Aldous owned the company, said it was the foreman's fault. So there was no settlement, no help. She's been managing alone since. She came to see me, Cora said, 2 days ago. Brought a pot of soup and a pair of wool socks. That sounds like Dorothea. She didn't come just for kindness, Cora said. She came because she wanted to know if what she had heard was true. That Tobias Graves's widow was living up here alone and hadn't left. She paused. She said if someone was standing up to Aldous Graves, she wanted to know about it. And then she said something else. Gideon waited. She said the Widowmaker wasn't an accident, Cora said. She said her husband had cleared that area himself the morning before. She said he was the most careful man she had ever known, and he would not have left a branch like that unsecured. She said she had never been able to prove it, but she had never stopped knowing it. Gideon's expression did not change, but something in it went very still. Cora continued. I asked Finch to look at the accident report before he left. He had access to the county records. He spent an afternoon with them, and he found a notation in the original filing, a detail that had been amended before the final report. The original assessment noted partial saw marks on the base of the branch.
The kind of mark that would result from cutting partway through a limb, far enough to weaken it, not far enough to show from below. The fire crackled. Gideon put his hand on the wall of the building. "And Tobias," he said quietly. She did not say anything because they both knew. Tobias had been asking questions about his father quietly for months before he died. She had seen him going through old papers in the late evenings, had heard him talking to the oldest hands at the mill, had watched him come back from those conversations with a face that looked like a man trying to carry something heavy without showing the weight. He had been getting close to something, and then a branch had fallen. She had not said this out loud to anyone before. She had thought it in the night hours, in the hollow wakefulness of the Graves house after the funeral. She had thought it and then put it away because thinking it made the world a thing she did not know how to live in. But here in this room, built by her father, with this man who had lost his own brother to the same hands, she said it. He was killed because he knew too much. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't need to. A week after that conversation, Dorothea Price came back. Not with soup this time, with her winter coat and a bag over her shoulder and a look on her face that had made a decision some time ago and had simply been waiting for the moment to say it out loud. "I want to help," she said. Cora looked at her. "This isn't safe," she said. Dorothea set her bag down on the table. "My husband is in the ground," she said. "My farm is gone. My children are with my sister in Tennessee because I can't feed them." She looked at Cora directly. "Safe stopped mattering to me some time back." Cora looked at this woman, 44 years old, and had already been through what most people couldn't survive once. Standing in the middle of a cold room in a mountain depot with her bag on the table and her chin level. "All right," Cora said. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. Two. Coming up the trail, fast. Not the careful pace of someone making a social call. Fast. Deliberate. Gideon was at the window before she reached it. He looked out. His jaw tightened. He said one word. Stellan. Stellan Graves was 28 years old and looked like his father, the way a shadow looks like the thing that casts it. The same frame, the same coloring, but something in the quality of it was different. Aldous Graves was cold in the way of deep winter, calculated, patient. He had waited 20 years for things he wanted, and waited comfortably. Stellan was a different kind of cold. He came through the door without knocking. His companion stayed outside. He looked at the room, at Gideon, at Dorothea, at Cora. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. It never reached his eyes, she suspected. She had seen him twice before at family gatherings, and had each time had the same sensation, that his expressions were something he had learned to produce rather than something he felt. "I heard you'd made something of the place," he said.
His voice was pleasant, conversational.
unhurried. I wanted to see for myself. She said nothing. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, hands behind his back, looking at the shelves, the windows, the hearth. He paused at the hearth. He looked at it for slightly longer than he looked at anything else. She watched him look at it.
My father is a patient man, Stellan said, finally not turning from the fireplace. He believes that time and circumstance will settle most problems. He turned then, looked at her. I am somewhat more practical. What do you want, Stellan? He tilted his head slightly, as if the directness surprised him but pleasantly. I want what my father wanted, he said. To see you comfortable, settled somewhere suitable. This place is not suitable. You must know that. I know no such thing, she said. He smiled again. Mrs. Voss, he said, you are a young woman alone in a mountain wilderness with a Virginia winter about to arrive. Whatever you think you're doing here, I assure you it is not worth the difficulty. Then it costs you nothing to leave me to it, she said. Something shifted in his face, very slightly, a thinning around the eyes. You're your father's daughter, he said. She went still. The room went still. He had said it lightly, casually, as if it were just a pleasantry, but the words had a weight to them that she felt in her chest. He knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the room, but he knew Edmund Voss had been here, knew there was something to know. She kept her face smooth. If that's a compliment, she said, I'll take it. He looked at her for one more moment, then he moved toward the door. He stopped in the doorway. Without turning back, he said, Tobias loved you, I think. That was probably his only real flaw. The door closed. She stood very still, heard the hoofbeats going back down the mountain, and understood. That was not a social call, and it was not a threat exactly. It was something more precise than a threat. It was a message, delivered in the particular language of men who have never needed to be loud about their power, because their power has never been questioned. He knows someone has been in this building, she said. Gideon moved away from the window. He doesn't know what you found, he said. Not yet. Not yet, she agreed. Dorothea looked from one of them to the other. How long do we have? She said. That night someone set fire to the east corner of the porch. She smelled it before she heard it. Woke from a shallow sleep to the acrid smell of burning wood, and was out the door with a bucket from the water barrel before she was fully awake. The corner post was alight, the dried wood taking eagerly. She beat it with the wet blanket first to knock down the worst of it, and then doused it from the barrel. Gideon was there within minutes. He had been sleeping in the small lean-to he'd built himself at the edge of the clearing. Together they put it out. They stood in the cold dark looking at the char on the post and the porch boards. Gideon said nothing for a while. Then message received. She looked at the burn mark, at the blackened wood, at the place that had been her father's work once and was her work now. She went inside, got the hammer, and in the dark, with Gideon holding a torch, she began cutting out the damaged boards to replace in the morning. Because that was what you did. You didn't stand and look at the damage. You assessed it. You figured out what could be saved and what needed to come out. And you built it back. Her father had taught her that. This place had been built to last, and she intended to last with it. She replaced the burned boards before dawn. That was the first thing. Not because anyone was watching, not to make a point, because a damaged thing left damaged has a way of becoming a damaged thing accepted. And she had not come this far to start accepting damage. The hammer in her hand was her father's hammer. The one from the carpet bag. The one she had taken from his tool shed the morning after he died, because it was the only thing of his that felt like him. Worn handle. The weight of it exactly right. The weight of his hand in it still somehow all these years later. She worked in the dark by torchlight while Gideon held the light steady, and neither of them spoke. The cold was serious now. The kind of cold that meant what it said. November had arrived in the Blue Ridge the way November always arrived up here. Not gradually, not politely, just suddenly, there filling every hollow and pressing down from the peaks with an authority that brooked no argument. The new boards went in true. She stood back and looked at them in the growing light. Good enough. Not finished. Nothing was ever finished. But good enough for today, which was all today required. Gideon handed her the coffee he had made on the hearth inside. She took it with both hands. They stood on the repaired porch in the cold gray morning and looked out over the mountain, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. Which was that whoever had set that fire the night before would be back, and the next time it would not be a corner post. Stellan Graves was not a patient man, so they needed to move faster than he was moving. The problem was Finch. Finch had been gone 9 days. Pennsylvania was not close. Even by rail, it was 3 days each way, and Finch was 71 years old, with a cane, and had not traveled farther than the county seat in the better part of a decade. She had sent him because he was the only one Leland Pruitt would trust. The only one who could walk up to a man who had spent 14 years hiding from his own past and say it is time to come back now. But 9 days was 9 days, and Stellan had shown his hand last night, which meant she needed to use what she had. Now, before Finch returned, before she had everything she needed, which was not ideal, which was terrifying actually, which was also, she reminded herself, exactly what her father would have said to do. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Perfect conditions don't come. You build with the materials you have on the day you have them.
She had the ledger. She had Pruitt's letter.
She had the gold. She had Gideon and Dorothea. And she had her father's last piece of work standing solid around her. That morning, people came. Not many. 4 at first, then 2 more before noon. Then another family in the afternoon, the Whitfield family, whose farm Aldous had been threatening with a debt collection for 6 months. They came the way people come when they have been waiting for a place to come to without knowing one existed. Quietly, without announcement. They brought what they had. A sack of dried beans, a wedge of hard cheese, a bundle of dried herbs hanging from a kitchen rafter somewhere that smelled of rosemary and cedar. Dorothea knew most of them. She was the one who had told them. Not in so many words. She had not said, "Come to the depot, something is happening." She had just mentioned to the right women that Tobias Graves's widow was up at Miller's Gap and was not leaving. And the right women had told others, and the others had done the math. Because when a woman, Aldous Graves, had tried to bury stays, standing people notice. Because this valley had been watching Aldous Graves for 20 years and was very tired. They did not ask Cora for anything. They did not expect a speech. They came and they stayed, and they made themselves useful, and the depot, which had been the home of one person a month ago, became something else. Warmer, fuller, the sound of voices in it, the smell of food cooking, something like a community, which was exactly what she needed it to be. Because the next morning Aldous Graves came. Alone. She saw him from the window, a single rider coming up the trail at a careful pace. No escort, no lawyer, no son. Just Aldous Graves on a good horse, his breath coming in plumes in the cold air, looking at the depot as he came into the clearing, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a very long time. He dismounted. He tied his horse. He stood in the clearing and looked at the building. And she had the strange sensation of watching a man recognize something. The way you recognize a place you have heard described many times but never seen. He had never been here. She was certain of that. But he knew this place, had known it for years, had known it the way you know a thing you are afraid of. She went to the door. She opened it before he could knock. They looked at each other. Aldous Graves in the clearing looked older than he had in the study. Or perhaps this light was more honest. The gray morning of the mountains, which had no interest in making anyone look better than they were. He was 62 years old and had spent those 62 years building and taking and calculating, and it showed in him in the way that kind of life always shows eventually. A hardness around the eyes, a set to the jaw. The look of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything except the things that threatened him. She was one of those things now. He looked past her at the depot. He said Edmund Voss built this room well. She said nothing. He knows. He's known. He just confirmed it. He met her eyes.
"May I come in?" he said. She stepped aside. He walked into the depot the way a careful man enters unfamiliar territory, noting exits, noting the people in the room, Dorothea at the far end, Gideon by the fire, 3 others she knew from the past days. His face showed nothing about what he thought of finding them here, but his eyes moved over them and catalogued. He stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the hearth. She watched him look at it. Something in his shoulders changed, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a degree. The adjustment of a man who has just confirmed something he needed to confirm. He turned from the fireplace. He said, "You found what Edmund left." She said, "Yes." He looked at her, a long, careful look. He said, "I have been waiting for this for 14 years. Not hoping for it, but waiting, because some things you cannot prevent. You can only delay them long enough to make other arrangements."
"What arrangements?" she said.
He moved to the table. He did not sit. He stood at it and put his hands on the edge. The hands of a 62-year-old man who had built an empire. Steady, sure, the kind of hands that had signed 1,000 documents and shaken 1,000 hands and never trembled once. They were not entirely steady now. "I will sign over the deeds," he said. "The farms that were taken for debt. 12 of them. I will sign them back to their original owners." She said nothing.
"The bank will renegotiate every outstanding note in the valley at fair terms."
He paused.
"I will fund it myself."
She waited, and this he said. He glanced toward the hearth.
"What Edmund left, what you found, it stays where it is. It stays buried."
She looked at him. This was the offer. Clear, specific, calibrated. He had thought about it carefully, had figured out the minimum that would satisfy her, had calculated her the way he calculated everything. She felt her father in her hands, in the weight of her arms, in the way she was standing. She said, "You think I want land and money." He said, "Everyone wants land and money." She said, "You built your entire life on one idea, that everyone is like you, that everyone has a price, that loyalty and honor and grief are just starting positions in a negotiation." His jaw tightened slightly. She said, "My husband is in the ground. Dorothea's husband is in the ground. Gideon's brother is in the ground. And you want me to bury what you did to them one more time so that your life can continue unchanged." He said, "What I am offering will materially help every family in this valley." She said, "It will help them, and it will help you."
"And in your mind, those 2 things are the same transaction."
He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him. She said, "I want the valley to breathe again. That is what I want." He said, "That is what I am offering." "No," she said. "What you are offering is a transaction." What I am talking about is something else." She paused. "The truth is part of it. It has to be." Something moved in his face. Fear, she realized. Not the cold, flat caution she had seen in his eyes all her life. Actual fear. The kind that lives underneath all the other things a man like Aldous Graves built over it. He said, "You will destroy everything." She said, "You destroyed everything." "I'm just accounting for it honestly." The room was very quiet. The fire made its small domestic sounds. The wind moved against the new glass in the windows. Outside somewhere, a woodpecker was making a methodical argument with a dead tree. Aldous Graves looked at his hands on the edge of the table. He looked at the hearth. He looked at his hands again, and for one moment she saw it. Behind the calculation, behind the flat gray competence of the man, something much older and much more frightened. A man who had made a choice in the autumn of 1862 that had seemed like a reasonable business decision and had spent 17 years building a life on top of it and had always known, always, that the foundation was wrong. He looked at her. He said, "Your father was a better man than I deserved." He picked up his hat from the table. He walked out. She stood at the window and watched him ride down the mountain trail, his back straight, his pace unhurried, the bearing of a man who has not yet arrived at the thing he is going to do, but has started moving in that direction. Gideon came to stand beside her. He said, "Do you trust that?" She said, "No." He nodded. "Good," he said. She sent the letters that same afternoon. She had written them over the past week. Carefully, in the same plain style her father had used for correspondence. Clear, specific, without dramatics. The first letter went to the Federal District Office in Richmond. It described the contents of the hidden room and requested formal inquiry. It included a copy of 3 specific ledger pages, the ones with the most specific dates and the most specific outcomes. The second letter went to a newspaper, not the local paper. Aldous owned the local paper in the particular way powerful men in small counties own the local paper. A larger paper, Baltimore, one that had covered the Reconstruction of the South, with what she judged from its back issues to be genuine interest rather than performance. Gideon rode down the mountain with both letters sealed and wrapped in oilskin against the weather. He went to a postal office 2 counties over, not the local one. He was back before dark. "It's done," he said. She nodded. They sat by the fire. Dorothea had made a pot of soup from the dried beans and the smoked ham someone had brought. The depot was full of the smell of it, of wood smoke and coffee, and the sound of people who had found somewhere to be. Cora sat at the table with her hands around a cup and thought about what she had set in motion. There was no taking it back now. Not that she wanted to, but there was something solemn about the moment.
The moment after you've done the thing you can't undo, when the world is already different but hasn't finished changing shape. She thought of her father.
She thought of him in this room, in the winter of 1864, alone or nearly alone, working by torchlight, she imagined, laying stone by stone in a small hidden space that no one was supposed to ever find. Doing it carefully because he was a man who could not do things carelessly. Doing it because a man he trusted had asked him to. And doing it for one more reason. The reason she had come to slowly over the past weeks. Because Edmund Voss had known what Aldous Graves was.
Had known it before Pruitt arrived. Had known it the way people in a small community always know things about each other that they never say out loud. And he had not been able to act on it. Had been one carpenter in a county owned by a powerful man with a daughter to raise and a living to earn and no proof beyond his own knowing. But he had built the room. And he had trusted that she would find it. Not just any she. Her, specifically. Cora. His daughter. I hope his daughter is like him. Pruitt had written that. Finch had told her Edmund had planned to act. Had come to Finch once and said he knew something. Had said he needed more time. He had not had more time. But he had built the room, and she was her father's daughter. She pressed her hand against the edge of the table, the worn wood of it, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. On the 12th day, Finch returned. She heard the horses before she saw them, and she was out the door before she had thought about going out the door. Because 12 days was 12 days, and things had been moving faster since Aldis's visit, and she had been sleeping lightly and waking at sounds. 2 horses, Finch on one, slow and careful on the mountain trail the way Finch always moved. On the other, an older man,
tall, once she thought, reduced now by age and something else, something that lived in the way he held himself, the particular careful bearing of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long he has forgotten what it feels like to stand without it. He was 65 or so, gray-bearded. His coat was city-made but old. His eyes, when he came close, were the sharp, pale blue of a man who had spent his life in intelligence work and had never quite turned it off. He looked at the depot, and his face did something complicated. Dr. Finch climbed down from his horse with the assistance of the fence post and his cane, and looked at Cora with his gray eyes. He said, "He came." She looked at Leland Pruitt. She said, "Captain Pruitt." He said, "Not Captain for a long time." He looked at the building again. "How is the room?" she said. "Dry, intact. Everything is where you left it." Something moved through him. She watched it happen. A long breath. The kind that releases something that has been held for longer than a breath should ever be held. He said, "Your father was the finest man I ever had the privilege to work alongside."
She did not say anything because she didn't need to, because it was enough to hear someone else say it, to have it confirmed, to have the room confirmed, and her father confirmed, and the 14 years of waiting and silence confirmed.
"Enough," she said finally. "Come inside." They all gathered in the depot that evening, all of them, Gideon and Dorothea and the others who had been coming. Pruitt at the table with the ledgers open before him, Finch beside him, Cora at the end. The fire going strong in the great hearth her father had been to and touched and worked beside. Pruitt read through the ledgers slowly, though he already knew what was in them. He had written some of those entries himself in a different life. He read them with the attention of a man preparing to stand before something formal and say what he knew to be true. He signed the document Finch had prepared. His testimony, sworn, dated, witnessed by Finch and Gideon and Dorothea. When he put the pen down, he looked at his hand for a moment. Then he looked at Cora. "He said I should have come back sooner." She said, "You couldn't." He said, "No, but I should have found a way." She looked at him, this man who had written a letter in the dark and trusted a carpenter he barely knew and spent 14 years in Pennsylvania waiting for something he could not control to resolve itself or not. She said, "You wrote the letter. That was the way." He looked at her. He said, "He told me about you, your father, when we were working on the room together. He said he had a daughter who had his hands. He said she would know what to do with what we left." She held that. Held it the way you hold something that is simultaneously wonderful and painful and true. She said, "He was right." 3 days after Pruitt signed his testimony, things began to happen in the valley. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with the public confrontations and the courthouse steps and the speeches that some part of her had imagined back when this had all been an idea rather than a thing in motion. Quietly, the way things actually change. It began with a letter delivered to the Graves house. Not from Cora. She did not send it. The letter came from the Federal District Office in Richmond, acknowledging receipt of a formal inquiry and requesting that certain documentation be made available for examination. She heard about it 2 days later from Dorothea, who had heard from a woman in town who had seen the federal courier's horse tied outside the Graves house for nearly an hour. Then a second letter to the county magistrate, requesting that certain land deed transfers made in the past decade be suspended pending review. The valley noticed. It did not speak loudly, but it noticed. It noticed the way a room notices when someone quietly opens a window and the air changes. Nothing dramatic, just a different quality to the atmosphere. A sense that something that had been sealed for a long time was beginning to move. And then one morning, a week after Finch and Pruitt arrived, Stellan Graves came back. She was outside when she heard them. 3 horses this time. She stood in the clearing in her coat with her axe in one hand because she had been splitting kindling,
and there was no reason to put down an axe just because someone was coming. He came through the tree line and saw her standing there. He stopped his horse. They looked at each other across the clearing. He was different from his last visit. The pleasant surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The quality of a man who has been told something he thought he controlled has gotten out of his hands. He dismounted. His two companions stayed on their horses. He walked toward her. She did not move. He stopped 10 feet away. He said, "The letters." She said, "Yes." He said, "You understand what you've done." She said, "I do." He said, "You've destroyed my family." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Your family destroyed itself. I just stopped covering for it." His jaw tightened. He said, "You have no idea the consequences. The people who depend on the grave's name, the jobs, the debts that will be called, the families that will suffer." She said, "The families are already suffering, have been for 20 years. Your father saw to that. He said, I can still make this difficult." She said, "You can." He said, "There are things that can be done, legally, that would take years to untangle." She said, "I expect so." He said, "You're not afraid." She said, "I didn't say that." He looked at her. She looked back, and she thought about what Finch had said in one of the evenings around the fire about men like Stellan Graves. He said the ones who aren't their fathers are the most dangerous because they have all the same tools and none of the same conscience. But they also have something the fathers don't. They still remember what it was like before they decided to be what they are. And that memory is a crack in everything. She said, "Stellan." He said nothing. She said, "Tobias knew you were capable of something different. He told me that once. He said you were the one who should have been different and weren't." Something moved in his face, fast, and then controlled, and then gone. But she had seen it. She said, "Whatever you do next, you'll know what you chose, and you'll know what you could have chosen instead." A long silence. The wind through the hemlocks, the horses moving in small, restless circles. He looked at her. He looked at the depot. He looked at his hands. And then Stellan Graves walked back to his horse mounted and rode back down the mountain without a word. His companions followed. She stood in the clearing and listened to the hoofbeats fade. She did not know what he would do. She did not know if he would fight it or accept it or disappear the way his father would eventually disappear. She did not know if the courts would be swift or slow or fair or compromised. She knew what she had sent. She knew what Pruitt had signed. She knew what Finch had taken to Richmond himself personally on the grounds that at 71 years old, he was not going to trust the most important document of his life to a postal bag. She knew the work had been done as well as it could be done. The rest was out of her hands. which was not a comfortable feeling, which was she was learning just what it felt like to have done everything you could do. A month later, Aldous Graves was gone. Not arrested, not convicted, not stood up in a courthouse and publicly named for what he was, though that would come in time in its own form. Simply gone. One morning, the white mansion on the hill had shuttered windows, and no smoke from its chimneys, and no horses in the stable. The town discovered it the way small towns discover things. Incrementally, with much discussion. The bank changed hands within a week. A new management that came recommended by the federal district office in Richmond. The first thing the new management did was call in Finch, who had been acting as an informal advisor, and ask him to help review the outstanding debt notes in the county, to see which ones were legitimate and which ones had been inflated. Most of them had been inflated. The renegotiations took 2 months. The farms were returned. The 12 deed transfers that Aldous had offered as a bargaining chip, but which came back now through legal process rather than personal transaction. 12 families who had lived with the particular weight of having lost their land to a man who had taken it because he could. That weight lifted. Not easily, not completely. Nothing this complicated lifts cleanly. But it lifted. The mill was reorganized, not shut. The men who worked it needed it to run, but reorganized under different terms. The workers with a share in its management, the decisions made by more than one man, and the gold in the iron-strapped chest in the hidden room behind the fireplace. Finch handled it, with Pruitt's guidance, with Cora's authorization. It was returned formally to the federal accounting. Some of it went to compensate families with documented losses traceable to Aldous's intelligence activities. What remained was applied to the community fund that Finch and Dorothea and a handful of others established to administer the renegotiated debts and fund the cooperative management of the mill. Cora took none of it for herself. People asked her about that, not loudly, but they asked. She said it was never mine, it was a trust. They looked at her. She said, "My father understood that. He didn't build that room to make someone rich. He built it to make things right." It was December when it finally snowed. The first real snow. Not the suggestions of snow that had been coming for weeks. The thing itself. A deep, silent, thorough covering that arrived overnight and transformed the Blue Ridge into something that looked like the world on its first morning. White and still and cold and brilliant. She woke to it, stood at the window of the depot, and looked out at the clearing covered in snow. The tree line white-laden, the sky a hard, brilliant blue above it, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. She made coffee. She took it out onto the repaired porch. She stood there with the cup in both hands and looked out over the transformed world and felt the cold on her face and the warmth in her palms and the solid floor of the porch under her boots that she had built and rebuilt and repaired with her own hands.
Behind her, the depot was warm. The great hearth was going. She could hear the draw of it even from outside. The perfect draft that her father had admired and that she had come to love the way she had come to love all the things this building did quietly and without complaint. On the mantelpiece, she knew were two things: the tin map case that Leland Pruitt had left for her. He had not taken it when he left, had pressed it into her hands and said, "Keep it here, where it belongs, in the room that was built to hold it."
And beside it, her father's tools, the hammer, the whetstone, the folding rule he had carried in his coat pocket for 20 years. She had brought them up from the carpet bag the week after she arrived and put them on the mantelpiece and had not moved them since. 3 men's legacies on a stone shelf in a mountain depot. Her father, who had built the truth into stone and trusted her to find it. Tobias, who had loved the mountains his father was destroying, and who had pressed a carved bird into her hand and told her without knowing he was telling her, "Don't let him make you small." And Leland Pruitt, a stranger who had written a letter in the dark and trusted a carpenter he barely knew and waited 14 years for the thing he could not do himself to be done. She reached into her coat pocket. The whippoorwill was there. She took it out and looked at it. The mountain laurel wood worn smooth from a year of her hand. The small, perfect form of a bird that called at dusk in the mountains and was almost never seen, only heard. Tobias had made it the winter before he died, had said he wanted to give her something that was just hers, not the house, not the name, not the life they were building inside the walls of his father's ambition. Something that had nothing to do with any of that, just hers. She closed her hand around it and looked out over the snow. The valley below was invisible from here, hidden by the mountains, which was the point in a way. The depot had been built here for exactly that reason. Good water, defensible position, a view clear down the valley on clear days, and on days like this, protected by the mountains entirely, held by them. She thought of all the things she had come here with. $20, a deed, a carpet bag with a spare dress and a bar of soap and her father's whetstone, and a small carved bird. She thought of all the things she was leaving this year with. Not money, not land, not power exactly. Something older than any of those things. The knowledge of what she was. Her father's daughter. Tobias's wife. The woman who had come to a ruin in October with $20 and the sentence of a man who thought her disposable and had found in that ruin the one thing he had spent 20 years trying to keep buried, the truth, and had done what her father had trusted she would do. She had built it into something that would last. The coffee was cooling in her hands. The snow made the world very quiet. Somewhere in the hemlocks at the tree line, a bird called once.
low and clear, the kind of call you almost missed if you were thinking about something else. She had heard that call before, on walks with Tobias along creek beds and ridge lines in the blue-green summer of the mountains. He would stop, go still, tilt his head, and then say her name the way he always said it when he wanted to make sure she was paying attention. Cora. Listen. She listened. The bird called again.
She closed her eyes, opened them. The Blue Ridge stretched out before her in every direction, white and enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The sky was the color of a promise. She went inside. She had work to do.